Good evening. My name is Kimberly Snyder, and I'm the Executive Director for New Museum Los Gatos, or New Mu. My preferred pronouns are she, her. Thank you for joining us tonight for the virtual artist talk with Liz Harvey, Plant Time, Textiles, Performance, and Yearning. We'll also be joined by past president and current board member of the Santa Clara County chapter of the California Native Plant Society and the current coordinator of the Native Plant Garden Tour, Madeline Morrow. And she'll be here to share some of their amazing work closer to the end of the program. This virtual program is in correlation with our current exhibition, The Lost Ones, Iterations and Murmurs, featuring the work of Liz Harvey. It's on view through April 14th, and the exhibition was guest curated by Elisa Polichuk and the San Francisco School of Needlework and Design. Come visit the exhibition before it closes. The museum's open Friday through Sunday, 10 to 4 p.m. And starting in April, we'll be open on Thursdays as well. So plenty of opportunities to come see the show. A special thank you to our sponsors who make all of New Muse exhibitions, programs, and operations possible. Thank you so much. We'll also be hosting an in-person workshop with Liz Harvey and New Mu curator and educator, Allison Raylo, and it will be stitching endangered California plants. That'll be taking place on Saturday, February 24th. So go ahead and purchase your tickets. But before we get into the talk, I want to just have a few housekeeping items. I'll be asking questions throughout the presentation. So if you have questions of your own, please feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. Any questions that we don't get to, we'll save some time at the end to go over and chat about them. And please stay muted unless you're called upon. Throughout the virtual talk, we'll be dropping links in the chat and other important information like we've already started. So there's going to be a bunch of helpful links there. In addition, we'll send up a follow-up email. So anything you missed, you'll be able to see in that email. So now I would like to introduce the person of the hour, Liz Harvey. Liz is a queer artist who makes textiles, collages, sculpture, and performance projects in order to disorient viewers and envision speculative, liberatory, interspecies futures. She uses craft processes to shed light on historical erasures of plant stories and queer history. In addition to collaborating on performances with choreographers, scientists, she generates imagery from discarded materials and textile surplus to create collages, banners, garments, and sculptures. Recently, her work has been featured in the Museum of Craft and Design in San Francisco, the Round Weather Gallery in Oakland. She is a founding member of the Mending Project Collective, an artist collective dedicated to creating space for people to engage with the metaphorical and practical potential of mending, in part to counter consumer consumption. Mending Collective offers mending workshops and organizes exhibitions. Liz has been a gardener since 2014 and excited to have grown one of the successful plants from seeds, a California stinging, is it lupin?
Yeah. A
Lupin.
lot of people say lupin. Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, Liz, I will pass it off to you, and we're so excited to learn more about your art practice.
Thank you, Kimberly, and the New Muse staff for supporting this talk and for supporting the exhibition. And thanks and welcome to everyone here. I think there are some familiar faces, or I should say names, on the Zoom, in the Zoom room, and some of you lovely people participated in the performances throughout the years. So I'm excited that you're here. And welcome questions, comments as we go through, as we mentioned earlier. And you're welcome to raise your hand, put them in the chat, and we're going to be addressing questions from Kimberly throughout the time that we're together, and from you all. And I want to just share a little bit about the performance project for those that aren't familiar with it, and then we'll go right into more slides and talking a little bit about different aspects of the project, and the exhibition that came out of it. So I'll be talking about the Lost Ones performance project. It ran from 2015 to 2019. The resulting show is called The Lost Ones Iterations and Murmurs. And The Lost Ones draws on the past to navigate towards an uncertain but yet hopeful future. I would say it's a layered project. So I'll dig around in the layers a bit here with you. I wasn't expecting to make a 5-year project. One of the collaborators I had challenged me to do that during the first year. Excuse me, during the first year. um, and one of the things that is true of the work that I do is that I often turn to disorientation as a strategy. So I wanted to open with that. I often am asking, what does it mean to be lost? What does it mean to not be sure what you're looking at or what's happening? And so 2015 was a disorienting time, and resulting, well, I should say the subsequent 4 years after that were as well for many of us. And conversations dealing with really the feelings related to climate change and accelerating uh, aspects of it, I felt were missing. Conversations related to that and related to the feelings about that were missing in 2015. So that was one of the things that spurred me to invite folks and try to grab folks' attention and draw them to having conversations and sharing, the range of feelings that people have. And I feel like art is uniquely suited to do that. Before we hop into more slides, I wanted to share that about 3/4 of the critically endangered plants on the dress, the images of them are California native plants. They're all considered very rare, and the remaining plants are from either other states in the US or other countries around the world. I did use California Native Plant Society's website, calscape.org, for a lot of the research that I did once I knew which plants I wanted to research more thoroughly. And then in the performance project itself, I did work with a number of collaborators. You're seeing Megan nicely here, who performed in the very first performance of the piece, which is what you're seeing in this slide. I also worked with a couple of other choreographer performers, Mary Ormantrout and Cherie Hill, and a science editor, Lauren Muscatine, who helped facilitate really some very wide-ranging conversations with folks in a couple of performances. I would say that I would say there were, I think I was maybe mentioning, but about 26 performances. I don't know if I've mentioned, so about 26 performances over those 5 years. And we performed at about 11 partner organizations. And really, the project was nurtured by residencies, including the wonderful artist studio program at the de Young and the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles residency, and other galleries and nonprofits around the Bay Area, and also Plan D Gallery in Los Angeles. And really, what's happening with the piece is that these rotating performers inhabit this embroidered garment to highlight overlooked species, untold histories, and little acknowledged art practices. So there's 39 critically endangered plants on the garment. And then just to kind of orient folks to the way that the performances worked, they were durational in nature, meaning they were about 3 hours long, maybe 1 hour at the least, with kind of a loose improvisational script that included a movement section as well as a stitching circle. The choreography that was featured was developed in collaboration with other artists who work in dance. And I would say, to our best estimate, about 2,400 audience members were engaged in the piece, which is one of the wonderful things about working on a project this long. Um, so I'm really grateful for all the partners that we worked with. So two other collaborators I want to mention include two master embroiderers, Lucy Barter and Annalie Levin, who were really integral to developing the piece from the point of view of engaging participants in embroidery who may not have been inclined to do so or may not have stitched before. I want to say that the New Mew show really focuses on artist process. So we'll be getting to that after I share a bit about the performances. So I think we'll go to the next slide. There's a couple of ideas I wanted to offer up to keep in mind during the talk. One is a definition offered up by Susan Cain, who wrote a book called Bittersweet recently. And she labels or describes the bittersweet as a tendency to states of longing, poignancy, and sorrow that are also simultaneous with the curiously piercing joy at the beauty of the world. So I wanted to offer that up, something to keep in mind as we go through these images. Next slide, please. And another idea that I think is useful to have in mind here is this notion of what makes a grievable life, question raised by Judith Butler and taken up by another theorist and writer who I find really to be a wonderful guide through the discipline of queer ecology, Katriana Mortimer Sandilands, and her take on what a grievable life might be is what would it look like to take seriously the fact that nature is currently ungrievable. And she wrote those words in 2010. So she's pointing out the deep grief, the deep connection with nature that often is not acknowledged, that leads to a deep sense of grief among folks then and now. And I'm interested in how that's in flux, perhaps because this idea of ecological grief has been written about since 2010 and shared about pretty widely. And then both of them are pointing to melancholia, which is a wonderful word for mourning something that has not been acknowledged within a wider context, maybe a mainstream context. And so that which is mourned is there's not a it's sort of a suspended state of mourning. Okay, next slide. The performances, I think I mentioned before, have two aspects, kind of a movement segment and a stitching circle segment. And so, yeah, I can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, that would be great, Liz. Can you tell us more about the performances, both the dance aspect and the sewing aspect and how they were combined?
I would love to. The single performer that you're seeing here really comes across as a in my mind, I'm thinking of her as a queer creature, cross species, part plant or part flower, part human, and the the way that they're sort of disorienting is important for the way that she operates in public space. So you're not really sure what this person's doing or why they're in this public space. And in our public performances, which is the bulk of them, we were really gearing what we were doing to both passersby and invited audiences. And that's true of this performance, which is in Los Angeles, where we were having our performer start behind the greenery and then slowly making her way out of the LA River Channel, up the embankment with some stops along the way to the audience, which is at the top of the embankment, along a bike path, which had many bikers stopping and to check out what was going on. And I think I'm really interested um, in the way that you're not able to locate exactly what direction she might be facing or where her head is and who's in the garment. Next slide, please. Um, this performer is Megan, nicely again, further along in the piece than the slide from before. And she's a Buto dancer trained in Buto. And Sam Lyons describes Buto as a style of avant-garde Japanese dance that uses slow, hyper-controlled, unpredictable movement. And it's really a perfect fit for this piece. It's really a dance style that's known to resist fixity, and it can really call into question what is natural movement and non-natural movement. Next slide, please. Um, and then I call these social stitching events or circles or segments. And as I said before, at times there were facilitated conversations about climate change, our relationship to plants during a changing climate, a time of a changing climate. And Lauren Muscatine, who is pictured on the left in red, is a science editor who was facilitating those conversations in some of the later performances. So next slide, please. People would come together, all ages 4 to 80 plus, and we would provide some stitching tutorial time for those that needed it. And people were free to stitch however they saw fit on patterns that were drawn on the dress with thread that was provided. And towards the end of the 5-year project, we started offering up in a more ritualized fashion the threads on these platters that I made. But I think really both the movement piece of the performances and the social stitching time really place plants as grievable and central, and also are hoping to kind of pull apart the hierarchical view of humans and non-humans, and that really nature includes humans. And who's to say where that boundary really is, when all life really depends on plants, arguably. And so plants as kin really interests me, and that's really a lot of what was going on in both of those sections. Next slide, please. um, and I think we're going to start talking about time now.
Yeah. So, Liz, one of the themes that keeps coming up is this idea of time and plant time. And how do those factor into the performances?
Yeah, I've other people have said it, but I like to think of some of what's going on in these performances as evoking plant time. And another aspect of time is this sort of playful evocation of time travel. So I was really interested in the 19th century figures of a couple of different female identifying historical figures who wrote autobiographies about their adventures in the world that were really um, very much taken up with plants. One is a botanical painter, Marianne North, and her connection with plants was really fueled by her personal wealth. She went around the world twice, painting plants as her passion, mostly tropical plants. And really the movement and the aspects of the performance that engaged with her story um, are somewhat oblique, but they have to do with this sort of loose narrative of her being in some ways subsumed by plants or subservient to them, or transforming into them. And I also think of her as a little bit of a Cassandra figure, kind of sometimes verbal, sometimes nonverbal, kind of warning us of the dangers of our ways, continuing in our ways. as a Western European influenced folk in the world. Um, and so the plant on the bottom right actually is named after her. She brought that to Western science. It's a plant that she painted as well. So you can see the painting there. Next slide, please. And so in performances, folks were either nonverbal or they may be saying the names of the plants or singing the names of the plants, kind of in concert with the story of Marianne North. Next slide, please. And then another historical figure that I was really excited about was a figure named Mary Seacole. And she is a multiracial woman with an African descent mother and a Scottish descent father who was grew up in Jamaica and identified as a very proud British citizen, very patriotic British citizen. And so that's in some ways why she's sort of wrapped in Western, a Western garment and identifies as a, European citizen. She traveled the world as well as a doctor. She called herself a doctress, a businesswoman, and unlike Marianne North, she was she self-funded all of her enterprises and her travels, and she basically carried herself off to the Crimean War and offered up her doctor services to the wounded and was very beloved as a British citizen. And then her story kind of fell away from being very widely known until more recently. And I think she's considered the most valuable Black Briton in terms of some surveys. So people do now learn about her in school and are aware of her in England and Britain. So these stories are coming back kind of into what is known, but are largely unknown. And I would say the art of embroidery is also kind of undervalued for many reasons. And it's, I feel, a great way to talk about sort of overlooked content, such as plants that might be leaving us and minor species such as plants and undervalued, life forms. So some of the more charismatic, I'll call them more charismatic species for folks when they're thinking about climate change and human impact on the environment are things, tend to be animals or large furry creatures like polar bears. So plants don't often get that top billing. And then I would say I was really interested in how plant time comes across through the movement. And I believe that as audiences, dance can be an embodied experience. Even just watching dance can produce an embodied experience. And of course, stitching is an embodied experience. Next slide, please. And so here we are engaging with Cherie Hill, the performer, for the performances that, some of the performances that we're engaging with Mary Seacole as a inspiration. Excuse me. Next slide, please. And here's Lauren in mid-facilitation. Next slide, please. Some of the movement that Cherie created, she really created a movement vocabulary based on some of the things, some of the ways that Mary Seacole wrote about her life as taking up space. She was raised in Jamaica and found American racism towards Black folks extremely uncool. She was very vocal about how Americans needed to get it together when it came to racism, and she spoke about it a couple of times publicly. Next slide, please. So she definitely took up space. Some of the movement that Cherie drew upon was based on her background, among other things, in African dance. So she drew on that as well for towards the end of the performance. Next slide. Okay, and then next slide. Frances Rosario is pictured here at the De Young, and so she also was engaging with Mary C. Cole, as did a couple of other performances in her choreography. Next slide, please. We were really excited to be able to share some more information about some of these. I find actually quite charismatic plants. And so we put together, I worked with a designer to put together a flyer that we handed out at early performances. And I'll tell some of these plant stories a little later on. Next slide, please. We also gave out a card. I only have a few left. That's why you're seeing it there. And we asked people to really kind of consider just being out hiking as an opportunity to be a citizen scientist in the world, to take their phone and download the iNaturalist app with them when they hike in the wild, and to share their observations of plants there by uploading them. And that is something that helps scientists who can't be everywhere all the time to get a better sense of what's happening and what's present as they try to understand what's going on with plants just generally. Okay, next slide, please.
So, Liz, now that we've got a comprehensive look on the performance aspect and the stitching that happened during the performances, what prompted you to want to show the dress post-performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I, definitely had in mind that this might be an object after the performances, but hadn't really worked that out until the pandemic hit in, as we all know, 4 years ago. And that was already going to be the end of the 5-year performance run. So I'm was able to, during the pandemic and until recently, start to think about what could happen next with the dress as object, dress as archive. Been talking to some of my artist friends about artists' archives and trying on that idea for this dress object now, post performance. If it's an archive, it's an unreliable one. A lot of these images are basically all of the images are based on drawings from photographs. The plants are extremely rare, and I haven't seen any of them in real life. About 25% of the plants are in far-flung parts of the world as well. And each of these images was drawn, not a tracing, but a drawing from various photographs that mostly scientists have taken of the plants over the years when they've been able to document them. And then people were free to elaborate on those drawings, which they did. And so those drawings are more often than not somewhat altered. And I knew I wanted to pair this object slash dress with the video, and that would be a way to reach maybe more people than a single performance could ever do. And I'm excited to be working on some kind of catalog. I think at this point it's shaping up to be too. Next slide, please. And so during the early days of the pandemic, I started to fill in with single thread embroidery between the plants, and was really thinking about what the science editor Lauren Muscatine had been saying, which was, I asked her, what happens when, I asked her, what does she think about plants trying to communicate to us? What are they trying, if anything, to share with us during this time when we have an exponential increase in plant extinction and all species extinction since the late 19th century? What's going on there? And she said, if we don't listen to, she says, yes, plants are speaking to us. And when we don't listen to them, they leave. So I've been thinking about kind of amplifying the voices of the plants here and thinking about spiritual abstraction and visual representations of sound waves and reverberations. And I wanted to continue to inscribe circles around these plants to continue to underscore, and the hoops are there as well on the dress now, which underscore this kind of botanical isolated view of plants and studying plants in isolation, and then counter that with this embroidery that is connecting plants, which is really more of an indigenous view of nature and of connections between all living things, and is more aligned with ecology. So next slide, please. So yeah, I worked on that for many months. Next slide, please. And the dress itself is an unreliable archive, I would say, because you can't really see everything clearly. There's the dress itself is really malleable and a soft kind of surface, and there's no file folders. It's very hard to get a handle on it. It's non-hierarchical by nature. And one of the things that the exhibition does, which is so exciting, is for me as an artist, is give people the opportunity to explore which plant is where on the dress through different means that we came up with. Next slide, please. So to that, I wanted to speak to some of these plants that I researched using California Native Plant Society's amazing tool, Calscape, which really I highly recommend, and you're going to hear more about. So here, there's just a few plant stories here. The first ones are from California. These are plants that are extremely rare. This is called Hoffman's rock crescent. It's actually sort of clinging. I picture it clinging. It's been described on cliffs in the sand, in the Channel Islands, actually. And one thing you learn when you research plants and endangered plants is that sometimes they track populations and individual plants if there are not enough plants for a population. So there are 3 to 4 populations of this plant still holding on. One of the things that's a problem for this plant is the introduction of livestock on the islands, which, like so many things in this project, is traced back to colonization. So yeah, there's some danger to this plant from climate change as well. Really it's the pigs on the island that are now feral that have made it, the habitat has become, it has shrunk quite a bit. So they're really kind of trying to be in their habitat, which includes the beach, but they're really on the beach cliffs only right now. Next slide, please. And this is the only plant on the dress represented that's extinct. It's presumed extinct. It was last seen in 1899, apparently. This is what I've been able to uncover as an amateur. And it was mistakenly thought to have been rediscovered in the 60s and in the 90s, I believe. But they were able to correct that error, and that material that was collected was the basis for a new plant that they had discovered, not the plant that you see here. And so it was extinct at the time that they made the dress, but it went in and out of that kind of status leading up to that time. Next slide, please. This plant is a beach plant. It's called pink sand verbena, and it's also been linked to the the western snowy plover, which many of you may know is endangered. And so conservation folks have been encouraged to coordinate their efforts because birds and plants are interrelated. And this can only be helpful to work on both in concert. This plant is one of the ones that starts to tug at people's heartstrings because there's only two apparently reported remaining individuals, and they are located somewhere in the coast of Northern California or Oregon. It's not clear where to me. Um, and open sandy beaches are required for this plant to thrive. One of the biggest problems for this plant, and some of you here I know about this because I think some of you work on plant conservation, but European beach grass was introduced and is a huge problem for this plant. And then next slide, please. These two are from outside California. These are wonderful plants to talk about. This one is has a wonderful name, Furbish lousewort, for Kate Furbish, the 19th century amateur botanist who discovered it slash quote unquote discovered slash brought it to science. This plant is from northern rural Maine and only lives on the banks of a river called the St. John's River. It also goes up into Canada, and it's recently been taken off the endangered list and is now in the vulnerable species list. It's still vulnerable, but not endangered. It's doing much better due to a lot of conservation efforts. It only lives in this one sort of riverbank area. And it's very much at risk due to climate change because the habitat that it grows in is reliant on ice scouring the banks of the St. John's River. So that could be a question going forward. And then, oh, and lousewort. So lousewort is one of those names that people at the time thought that this plant carried lice. Completely not true. So it has this sort of slightly wonderful name. It sounds like something out of Roald Dahl or something. Anyway, next slide, please. And this plant is the last remaining individual of a palm tree called the Mauritian palm, and it's about 150 years old, this tree, and scientists have successfully propagated seedlings. It's really hard to do because the male and female flowers bloom at different times. And so to self-pollinate it's not how it's designed. But the seedlings really only survived briefly, and so they haven't been able to be successful with generating new baby palm trees. So this may be the last one of its kind, which would be called an endling, which is a new word to me. And this is on the island of Mauritius. So let's take a quick look at the show. Next slide, please.
Liz, thank you for sharing those stories about plants. I love learning about them. I have another question that I'll save till the end. But how did you work with Elisa Polachek, the curator, to develop the exhibition? And then a second question, I noticed that you added the headpiece in the exhibition at New Mew, and I'm wondering how that got incorporated in as well.
Yeah, thanks. So Elisa came to a studio visit, and we kind of opened up all the drawers and the boxes and looked at all of the material that led to the performances, and hadn't really looked at that material for years. And we had many kinds of possible ways into presenting this sort of archive dress and video. And she proposed that we look at it from the angle of artist process rather than many other ways to go. And so I was excited about that as a possibility. That's a rare thing for an artist, I think, to be able to show process and have that be truly embraced and truly of interest to folks. And so she gathered up all the materials, and we kind of worked together to figure out the best way to present things. The headdress is called Head Trip, and it's actually a kind of in contrast to the dress. These are plants that are doing extremely well and extremely well known. They're psychedelic plants. They're plants like agave and weed slash marijuana, plants that have an effect on people's consciousness, you could say. And so that was incorporated into several performances too. Worn by other performers and this performer, and so I incorporated that into this installation. Next slide, please. And I hope you can come visit the exhibition if you haven't already. Sometimes artists, struggle with what they're going to be making next. And in this case, I had already been thinking in my mind in 2015 about, had in mind an earlier performance where I had stitched on a garment that I had been wearing. And that ended up really coming together with this desire to do something linked to declining numbers of thriving native plants. So I really kind of had really just a kind of a vision of what I wanted to do, and did many, many drawings to see if there were other ways that I could approach it, and ended up going with the first idea, which is pretty rare for me. Often my first idea is not my best idea. We can go to the next slide. These are slides from 15 years prior where I performed in a performance called The Unquiet Grave, in which I sewed wounds on my garment, quote unquote, wounds, and gave away all kinds of strange bundles to people. So that had been something that I knew I wanted to return to, some stitching on garments that I or others were wearing. Next slide, please. So you can see some of the drawings here. It's really fun to be able to show these, and just trying out different ways of thinking about it and what I could make happen, fashion with enough fabric for people to be able to stitch and to be able to access on someone who's actually wearing the garment. Next slide, please. This Elisa and I wanted to feature the tracing drawings for the dress that I made in between, the research and getting these plant patterns on the garment. And so these are tracing paper drawings that are not to scale and are fairly idiosyncratic. And I made many more that aren't here, but these are the ones that ended up on the dress. And it's kind of like an artist bulletin board presentation, which I'm lucky to have a nice big bulletin board in my studio. Next slide, please. We feature video in the exhibition, and we're going to share a video compilation link at the end, a couple of them. It's hard to show video, I find, on Zoom. It doesn't always read very well and can be a little choppy. Next slide, please. The timeline. So Elisa proposed a timeline of the performances, which was really another exciting thing for me as an artist to take on with her. And we juxtaposed basically gains and setbacks for both queer people and, environmentally speaking, during the time frame of the performances from 2015 to 2019, so 5 years. And I was really grateful to be able to highlight the shared vulnerability of queer bodies in the environment, of course, as you know, that coincided with an administration that was not friendly to either here in the United States. And so we can zoom in on some of these. Let's go to the next slide. Um, so 2015 kind of kicks off with two things that, you know, really are placeholders for me all these years later, 9 years later. In the United States, the LGBTQ employment discrimination definition changes to include gender identity. Huge, so important, really foundational to so many people's lives. And then also that was the year of the Paris Agreement, COP21, where if you go to the next slide, 2 years later, the United States chose to withdraw from said agreement, increasing the importance, I wrote here, of local action. And 2 years later, also Oregon becomes the first state to legally recognize the non-binary, non-conforming gender on driver's licenses. So thank you, Oregon. And we invite people to wander through the timeline and add their own important events in their lives, in the lives of their loved ones. So this person's important events are voting and speaking out about issues in that time frame. Next slide. And then further along towards the end of the performance run, I think there's hope to be found in the upsurge of the next generation. I'll say the next generation coming into their own and leading climate strikes, leading public demonstrations, leading Greta Thunberg and others, as we know, are really engaged in this work. And I take hope there, especially going into this year, 2024, and everything that I think we're in for a bit of a wild ride this year, and everything that we're, you know, anticipating having to navigate going forward too, with regard to queer bodies in the environment, particularly around climate change. Next slide. So I want to just leave us with this notion that you know, art provides connection. Aldo Leopold, who's the father of wildlife ecology, he's famous for saying about 75 years ago, an ecological education means that we are alone in a world of wounds. It's a pretty intense statement. And I feel like, yes, rare plants may be leaving, they may not be leaving. There is grief, there is hope. I feel as an artist, art can open up space to sit with both of those things that may move some to action, and that really being together in this sitting with things is the aim of this project. And some may find that collective action is more available to them than they realized, or that they had thought before. It is always available to us. There's so many ways to plug into these things. So I want to leave you with that. And then let's go to the next slide. There's a few little things for folks. There's references here. And then if we go to the next slide, there are ways to stay in touch. Please do. There's also some ways to support scientists and native plants. And you can sign up for, I have a very occasional newsletter and very occasional, you know, invitations to things that you might be interested in. I also put the contact info for all of my key collaborators here, and invite people to download the iNaturalist Lab app, and also check out an article about the project on feral fabric. And I'm just so excited about Madeline from California Native Plant Society being here, because she'll pick up on this idea that collective action is available to us in right here in our backyards, literally through gardening and other means. And I'm super excited that she's going to share a little bit about the work that California Native Plant Society is doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz, for that wonderful presentation. And Madeline, thank you again for being here representing California Native Plant Society. We were excited to reach out to them as a potential program partner because they do so much advocacy on California native plant preservation and conservation. And when you visit the exhibition, they have dropped off these lovely bloom books that were created by the state agency that, if you can see it, they talk about all the local California native plants. So Madeline, why don't you share a little bit more about California Native Plant Society and the good work you do, and also a little bit about Calscape.
Okay, great. How about the next slide? Um, so if you haven't heard of CNP, California Native Plant Society, which I will call CNPS, it's, a nonprofit environmental organization. We have 36 chapters, and it goes down to Baja California because the California floristic province actually goes into beyond the border of California and slightly into Oregon. But it's kind of amazing that this area is largely contiguous with the state boundaries. So our mission is to protect California native plants in their native habitats. And this mission was updated recently to include the fact that we're working through science, education, stewardship, gardening, and advocacy, many avenues. And by joining CNPS, I help support the very active conservation work of the state organization and our local chapter. And next slide, please. I just want to talk a little bit about Calscape. It's an app for native plant gardening that it's not a phone app. You need a larger computer to do it. And it pulls together information from many valuable databases like CalFlora, which Liz used, which is a great more science-oriented base, and things from different botanic gardens. And one of the things you can do is you can type in your zip code and look for plants that are native to your area. And it is now segmented. So we have 438 plants are in Calscape native to the Los Gatos zip code. When I do this as a gardener, I put a filter on to look for ones that are available in nurseries. But if you just want to look at what's out there, this is great. And then next slide, please. And it's very valuable for a plant. I put in here coast silk tassel as a plant that will grow in our area. And the map shows where it is found in the wild. And this is all really useful to a gardener. It tells you all kinds of things of what it likes. You can look up what nurseries it's available from. And a little further down, I just had one. It will tell you also its value as a habitat plant. How many moths and butterflies use that plant for their larvae, and as a gardener, it's really useful to tell you how big it will get, which helps. Most gardeners are over optimistic. This is very useful information to say, yes, this will fit in my space. No, it will not. And I was going to have Calscape available just in case I wanted to add some other feature, but it has it's uncharacteristically down right now. So I would say check it out tomorrow. I've been checking all through the presentation. It is not responding. Just next slide, please. We run a lot of events. This is a sample. But if you're interested in learning more about native plants or getting involved, as a gardener, the seed and cutting exchange, we'll have plenty of stuff. You can just show up and get free seeds at this event on Sunday. And we have a talk next week, and I'm going to briefly quote from Beautiful California Diversity. This is by a professor from San Jose State. And she's saying, we share the earth with millions of other species, but our plant is experiencing a biodiversity crisis in which a significant portion of these species are in danger of extinction in the coming decades. In this talk, we will discuss the causes of the current biodiversity crisis with a focus on California biodiversity. And by the way, California is a biodiversity hotspot. We will discuss which species are most endangered, what we can do to try to limit the loss of species, and efforts underway in our region to preserve our local biodiversity, especially endangered plants, invertebrates, and animal species. That talk's at Cupertino Library, and I think it's going to be super interesting. We are currently working on using our technology to record our talks, to video our talks, and make them available on our YouTube channel, but can't make promises because we're still working it out. It was very easy when they were on Zoom. This is more complicated. And there's a field trip, which you can go to our website to sign up for if you're interested in, and join the mailing list. And in the spring, next slide, please, we have in April, which is around us, is the hot season for California wildflowers. We have two big events. Our native plant garden tour. These events are free. And we have over 50 gardens on the tour this year. And we run it 2 days because it's too much for one day. And then the West Valley, we partner with West Valley College for a wildflower show, where if you can't get out into the mountains and the parks to see our wildflowers, licensed collectors, we don't just go randomly pick them, bring in samples and you can see them, and we'll have talks and we'll have activities. It's family friendly. So I wanted to leave you with that. And I hope and I could say lots more, but I will finish up and say thank you very much for inviting me. And I love seeing what Liz has done with the information in those databases. Done.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeline. The garden tour sounds fantastic. I don't know how you can view 50 gardens in over a weekend. It sounds ambitious, but very fun.
You have to pick which ones you want to visit. There's something for everyone of all sizes.
Well, I just wanted to remind everyone. Oh, wait, first, actually, we can stay up to 5 minutes after, and I just wanted to see if we had any other questions for Liz or Madeline. If you'd like to raise your hand and unmute, we'd love to hear from you, or you can drop your question in the chat. Fabulous. Liz, I had a question for you that I was thinking as you were presenting. I don't recall you addressing like the style of the dress that was created or the materials that you used for the creation of the dress. And I wondered if there was any specific, reason for the design that you chose.
Thanks. Yeah. I did use linen because I quickly learned from my master embroidery mentor, Annalie Levin, that it has a porous enough weave for anyone to easily stitch. And plus I love linen. I absolutely love linen. And then the dress design, I wanted to kind of stay with this idea of the late 19th century, and I was able to kind of happily discovered dress styles of 1890 were really voluminous sleeves, skirts, lots of space to add plant drawings and stitching. And so that really lent itself to what I had in mind. I did think about a long and possibly long skirt, but so many other artists have done that. And I decided I wanted it to be sort of recognizable from that era, but be queered in a way or made strange in a way by the hoops.
Oh, okay.
Create kind of like sculptural surfaces, almost like um a nod to cubism or something in a way. So yeah, you can see when you compare to the dress pattern, I was able to find a historic pattern house, and they sent me this pattern from 1890. But I added several panels in the skirt to make it really flat when people sat around her, and then around the performer. And then I also um, made the sleeve, they're mutton sleeves, they're called, much more. I added much more fabric there, so they're really super balloony. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense with the 18th century because those are also the illustrators that you had showcased as well, that you were inspired by, that you had talked about earlier.
Mm.
I have one more question for you if we don't have any more in the chat. Um, what was the process like collaborating with the performing artists, and how did you find them and sharing your vision of what the performance could be?
You know, I had collaborated with musicians before, and movement embodied ideas of embodiment had been something I'd been working on before. I had had regular folks come and wear things and move around, and I had done it. And musicians had played violin, moving around. Oh yeah, here's a close up. Close up. Um, Strange headwear. And so yeah, but I had really worked closely with dancers and choreographers. And so it was such an incredible journey. And I was so lucky to have been connected to both Mary Armentrout and Megan Nicely initially, because both of them work in education. They were both really great communicators. They very conceptual in their practices. So they were really excited to take on ideas, and we did, quite a bit of chatting in cafes before we ever moved. And then working with Cherie Hill, I was really just so honored that she felt drawn to the project. And in our multiracial collaboration, was able to find a personal connection because of some of her heritage is from Jamaica. And we both learned a lot in that process about what could be possible drawing on someone's autobiography. So I didn't have them read the whole, none of them were, I didn't task them with reading these whole books, but I gave them some excerpts, and they were just great. And they helped me work with other performers who weren't developing choreography directly, but were kind of improvising using their prompts. And choreographers are really we did one rehearsal for each performance. We kind of went into things with a very improvised approach to a set score, where we had timings worked out and place worked out, and then they worked from there. So with one rehearsal and one durational performance, they were really flexible and just incredibly professional collaborators to work with. Is really lucky.
Yeah, I mean, the images are absolutely stunning, and also the video. And then somebody had asked in the chat where they can see the videos, which you said are available on YouTube. Um, Perhaps there's a link that we can drop in the chat. But with that, I just want to thank everyone again. Liz, do you have anything you'd like to add as we close out the virtual artist talk?
Just a big thank you to everyone who's here and who spent some time with us tonight. And also, I think Jamie needs to be thanked for her wonderful
Oh,
behind the scenes work as a New Muse staffer. Thank you, Jamie. Woohoo. And I think she's going to be sending out little post Zoom talk notes that'll include that video link. So if you didn't see it here, it'll come to you. And also just a big thank you to Madeline, because I can see that she is propagating, she is growing a critically endangered plant, which is inspiring because I'm still not aware of any that, so now I am, that you can grow yourself, because that is, I think, rare, but very cool.
Well, fabulous. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. And a reminder that The Lost Ones, Iterations and Murmurs is on view through April 14th in the Michael and Elise Parsons Reception Gallery at New Museum Los Gatos. And if you want to chat with Liz more and also do some wonderful embroidery, you can join us for our event on February 24th. And we will be following up with an email to everyone who registered for the program. And thank you, Liz, so much for sharing your wonderful work with us. And thank you, Madeline, for sharing more about California Native Plant Society. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening. Hope to see you at the museum soon.
Thank you.